The empirical aloofness of the concept of wisdom. So, verbal realism. We typically fail to see just how much of what we take to be reality is a product of our symbol systems. Now, what I want to argue, I'll give you the punchline right away. I'm going to be somewhat critical of wisdom research, but I'm not going to be critical of wisdom, the people who study wisdom. My criticism is directed towards psychological science and our methods for studying virtually any psychological concept, and it is really put in relief by looking at the study of wisdom. The idea is that what we tend to do in psychology is to take value judgments and dress them up as psychological constructs that can be studied objectively and independent of culture and evaluation. This is a problem. And this is what brings us to verbal realism, this idea that I suggest that we typically fail to see just how much of what we take to be reality, wisdom, for example, as a product of our social systems, of our symbol systems. So we've got this natural mindset. The natural mindset is that the world is full of things. And to find out what's out there, well, you just look at what's out there, you label it, you label what you see. So here's thingism. There's a thing in the world. We look at it and we label it. It's a stone. Somebody comes along and says, yeah, I agree. Let's call it a stone. That's a stone. And since it's a thing, we can measure it. We can look very closely at it. We can analyze it, and we can analyze it independent of our own psychological experiences, if you will. So that's the natural mindset. Now, what happens quite often is we reify our concepts. We take the world of things that we're able to look at. We believe that our words refer to things in the world. If there's a word, well, it must refer to something in the real world. And therefore, we can find out about that thing in the world simply by looking at the world very carefully. So again, there's our label over there. We have a word. That word gets transformed into a real thing, reification. This happens all the time in our field. We treat the word as if it refers to a real thing. And if that's so, we can find out about the real thing by looking very carefully at it. So we have a word, wisdom. What's wisdom, we ask? Well, if we take the scientific mindset, the naturalistic mindset, we'll say, let's look very closely to find out. Except there's no thing there. There's nothing there to look at that is independent of our already pre-existing value judgments, I'm going to suggest. So where does the meaning of the term wisdom come from, if not from looking at the world as if we were looking at a rock? Wisdom is an axiological term. It has value connotations. It's defined in terms of conceptions of the good. We cannot identify wisdom apart from conceptions of the good, and this flies in the face of objectivity and the objectivity that we strive to when we think of psychological science as an objective or empirical science. This brings in the question of cultural history. Here's Nozick's definition of wisdom. I love it. Wisdom is what you need to understand in order to live well and cope with the central problems and avoid the dangers in the predicaments that human beings find themselves in. So to live well, values the good, cope with central problems, values and good, avoid dangers, values and good, predicament, values and good. It's replete with value judgments. And this is a product, concept of wisdom is a product of culture. Culture is a series of shared and contested beliefs, practices, and values. And over the series of cultural history, we come up with some notion of history. Quite often it looks like that. And then we have the word wisdom. It's a word, and the word refers to a concept, not a thing in the world, I suggest. And then, of course, culture will continue to develop as we play around with this idea. That's where the concept of culture comes from. It doesn't come from looking at the world. So there's our concept of culture. And then we get together, and the way each person gets the concept of culture, again, is not by looking within or even by looking at wise things that present themselves as wise, but instead from the culture itself. The culture is distributed within us, both shared and contested beliefs. The concept of wisdom is an appropriation from cultural history. It can't be studied independent of cultural history. It is not a thing to be observed. But we're scientists, we say. We engage in the objective analysis of empirical data. So we make a distinction, if you will, between the theoretical world or the axiological world, the cultural world, and the empirical world, the world of what is. And we have a boundary between those. And of course, we acknowledge that there is cultural history, but the cultural history is something independent of science and scientific objective analysis. So we get rid of it. We ignore it quite often. We pretend it's not there. And instead, we go back to this idea that we're going to find wisdom by looking into the world. What's wisdom? As if we were studying what is rather than what ought to be. Let's look closely and analyze it. Except again, there's no thing there to measure. What do? Well, what happens if we tend to, if we want to use our empirical methods and believe that that's the thing we're supposed to be doing, is we look at wisdom in our research participants and we use our standard methodologies and we ask our subjects to identify wisdom. Or we say, what is wisdom? What are the characteristics of a wise person? And note that already here, we're not studying wisdom, we're studying beliefs about wisdom. Neither a researcher nor the participant can identify an instance of wisdom without already having some sense of what wisdom is. That what we're studying is a product of both the cultural concept of wisdom and the methods, the artifacts of methods that we are using to structure how people are answering questions. There's no empirical content to study. What is being studied is not objective. There's no empirical study to content independent of our value judgments. Might be a better way to say that. The concept of wisdom is already culturally prefigured in both scientists and the research participants. So there it is. You've got your cultural concept of wisdom. You've got your scientists there, and the culture brings the concept of wisdom through all of them, the scientists and the participants alike. Now, this doesn't mean we can't study wisdom. It simply means that we should stop hiding behind the pretense that what we're doing is something objective or empirical alone. What we should strive for is an intersubjective rather than objective psychological science. Now, what might that look like? Intersubjectivity is the capacity to coordinate, share, and mutually incorporate experience between people. We often think that there is something called subjectivity and that the opposite of something called objectivity. Well, I suggest that intersubjectivity provides an alternative to thinking about either subjectivity or objectivity. I think we should lose both those terms and that we should think primarily in terms of intersubjective experience. A better word actually would be interexperiential approach, that instead of intersubjectivity, we're engaged in interexperientiality, but I think that's 9 or 10 syllables. Humans are intersubjective beings. We gain our knowledge of each other. We gain psychological knowledge, not by looking at the empirical world, quote unquote, objectively, nor by introspecting into the subjective world. We gain it through our capacity for intersubjectivity and to use language to identify that which we share between us. So how do you work toward a more intersubjective science? It might look something like this. Again, we are always part of culture. We cannot separate ourselves from that. That's where our concepts come from the intersubjective backdrop of culture. And our culture brings those concepts through us as scientists, through us as research participants. The concept of wisdom from each individual scientist, if you will, comes from the culture. And then what has to happen is that the scientists have to corroborate their concept of wisdom. Remember, culture is both shared and contested. So we have to corroborate. We have to come up with a term. Well, how are we going to define this term? It's not the correct definition. It doesn't come from the world. It comes from a history of culture that we're going to corroborate. And then when we do our studies, we go in there and this person identifies, based upon their corroborated notion of wisdom, what a wise act looks like. Well, there's a wise act I see in that person. And that person, the other scientist, either looks at that same act or another act, so that's a wise act. But then they have to corroborate their individual characterization of the wise act against the shared conception of wisdom that they are both looking at. And not only do they have to corroborate their observation, if you will, their interpretive observation against their shared understanding of wisdom, they have to corroborate that corroboration between and amongst themselves. This would be a psychological science in which we're not relying upon the idea that we are finding objectivities by looking in the world. It would acknowledge the complexity of humans as intersubjective beings who are embedded in culture, who cannot be otherwise, while at the same time providing a framework for rigorous analysis of psychological concepts. Thanks for listening.